Kenny S, in late 2014, coming to early 2015, when he was in his absolute god mode, maybe even the best CSGO player ever in terms of that peak of time, his top peak compared to other top peaks. When he was in this incredible peak of form, one of the interesting things about it that was unique actually in the history of CSGO compared to those other godlike players who hit that super peak and were the best player in the world was that he was on a significantly worse team. He was on a team that couldn't actually win big titles, or if they could, it would have been by the narrowest margin, and he had to do those godlike plays to even give him a chance to win. Now, we've got a current example of a similar scenario where, an even more extreme one, where the player Simple, who I recently wrote an article about, or maybe I'll link it down below in the description box. He's super hard carrying this Flipside team, who at the moment are ranked 9th best in my top 10 rankings, basically almost only but as a result of him and his play. And so if him and his godlike play is only getting them to 9th in the world, you can see the sort of burden he has as the hard carry. Now, the reason I wanted to make this video is because I feel as though there's a real misunderstanding, first of all, of how difficult what these guys are doing is. And then secondly, people actually... it sounds like people are hating on them, but I think they're just misunderstanding the burden that these guys face when they try to downplay the guy. And there's this line that people often repeat, which is like, oh, they just are able to do that because they're on a bad team. It's because they're on a bad team without other stars like vying for attention and taking focus away from them. And the team knows like, oh, we'll just focus all on this guy. That's what props these guys up. It's the idea that like no man can be that much greater than any other one, only if he like stands on the shoulders of the others and then they all sacrifice to make him the great player. I can see where some of this is coming from, but it's actually kind of disrespectful in a way if you understand the context of what these players are having to do, the history of great players, and the both sides of what happens of being that focal point. So that's what I kind of want to go through here, because it's the sort of thing I don't really want to have to address in a historical article about these players, because it's a pointless argument actually when you think it through. And so I'd rather just focus on the real aspects of what they're doing there. So it's ideal for a video and a rant. So first of all, let's start off with what these guys are doing, because if you really understand the context, it's incredible. Like, it's not just that these guys are really, really good players. There's even a heroic quality to it, where the fact that they can be this great, persevering in the face of not having help from teammates in a game like CS, where you have to put up frags to win games, not having a system around them that necessarily can cover their weaknesses even. They actually have to be superlatively good to give them teams a chance to win. And yet, other stars that fans, even experts, might even consider better than them or judge at the same level, have all these benefits, all these advantages. And if you don't acknowledge what this guy's having to go through, I think that's it's just you don't appreciate the game as much to me. So let's talk about, first of all, about the immense burden. It's not just that they have a burden like they have to carry. It's an immense burden. Think about players like Kenny S and Simple. When they play a game where their team is playing one of the better teams than them. So in the case of Simple and Flipside now, that would be any of the top 8 teams. Now, admittedly, I have Dignitas 8, so that's not that far off, but any of the top 7, so like Titan, Na'Vi, Virtus.pro, NiP, TSM, Fnatic, Envious, any of these teams. And in the case of Kenny S, even at his best, Titan was like maybe they could have been like a 5th or 6th best team, like just around the Kaylee era, maybe after that 6th or 7th best. So you're talking about the top 5 teams in the world. You're talking about some of the absolute best teams in the world. Anytime you face those teams, because in most cases, those teams have, and now this is in most cases, because obviously Titan did have some good strategy, but in most cases they have like a better team play, they have a better quality of team player even, they have better quality of skilled players. So they might have a bunch of players who are close to your level, or maybe they have like 3-star players and you have your 1-star player like Kenny S, or they might have much better players in terms of experience, tenured, while you have the leftovers or the younger players or players who never really made it further before. They have almost every advantage going for them. Meanwhile, you have just this guy, the solo carry, the Kenny S, the Simple. Now, the immense burden of that means that when this guy, Kenny S Simple, goes into that game, not only is what I'm about to say accurate, but they know it's accurate. So think about this. They basically, in most of the games they're gonna actually win against the better teams, have to be the best player in the entire server. Not just the best player for their team, the best player in the entire server. They have to be better than their own team and be the best they can be. And then they usually have to not only exceed the opponent's star player, but sometimes by a lot if if it's Fnatic and they have 2 or 3 star players, or if it's TSM and they have 2 or 3 star players. You have to basically like almost go 1 on 3 in the star department in terms of putting up sheer numbers and delivering a monster performance and dominating many areas of the game. You have to ultra dominate them, and that's not always just to win. That's the sick part. It's to sometimes win. Think about how Titan would sometimes get a win over Fnatic, but then they'd lose to Envious a lot, where they have a lot of talent there. So it's that you have to do that, all of that, to sometimes win. And then sometimes to get super close and not win. And sometimes to have a super solo carry performance but lose by like 6 rounds, despite the fact you just played some otherworldly performance that on any normal team, top team, and on any of the top 4 teams would have like, boom, put you into like an absolute domination. You haven't done anything differently and you'd have won the game quite easily. Not only that, but that's the other context, what I mentioned before. Not only do they have to do that, not only is that a fact of their reality, but they know it's a fact, and yet in their God mode, in Kenny S earlier on, and now Simple, they still do it anyway. That pressure doesn't destroy them. Device is an incredibly talented player on a team that has always had a lot of skill, and he's always had a lot of advantages, a lot of skill around him, a lot of players who've been at the top, a lot of players who've been deep in tournaments, and yet he was having pressure issues just performing to his own level, being a very good player, in most of the deep games. These guys are having to have that sort of pressure every game of their career, even in group stages, because if they go out in the group stage, people are going to be like, oh, what a shit team. They have to carry versus some of those teams even. They're having all this pressure, and yet they're putting up with it. And not only are they putting up with it, they're thriving from it. They're having the best games of their career with all the disadvantages almost you could have as a player. That's like absolutely admirable. Even beyond just the awe and the kind of marvel that you have when you look at their playing. You know, what incredible players. Just, you've got to admire the spirit, the fortitude, the resilience to be able to even play in that circumstance and then to play your best. Well, this is just incredible stuff. That alone needs to be noted. Also, not only do their best performances have to go there just to get them a win. I mean, a great example, obviously, is the second map of the iOS Pantamera final, where Titan was there, and they actually lose this game in overtime to Fnatic, who is the best team in the world, and have obviously since proven to be the best team in the world. I mean, technically, I didn't have them ranked. It was after that tournament they go back to number 1, but they were number 2 ranked, and they've obviously, over this era, proven to easily be the best team in the world. On the second map, which was lost in overtime by Titan, Kenny S got 50 kills, and not 50 kills as in 50 kills, but 49 deaths, had some insane kill-death ratio, and all the stats were utterly insane. It might be the best single game of CSGO played by anyone ever, and he lost that game. Now imagine what that does to you psychologically. Imagine having to know that you can do that and not even win necessarily. Normally, if a great player has a breakout game on a top team that has the pieces around him, that's an automatic win. If All of Them goes crazy, if Guardian goes crazy, if Snacks goes crazy, that's pretty much an automatic win, unless they're versus like the best team in the world. Now in this particular case, obviously he kind of was against the best team in the world, but this has happened multiple times for Kenny S, obviously. There have been multiple games where he had to drop 30, 40, and sometimes they lost. Sometimes they narrowly won. The burden is immense on these guys. You also have to consider this. There's another side to this, which is when the player knows himself, I have to hard carry, and he has to hard carry to win the game, you think the enemy doesn't know that. Of course the enemy knows that. The enemy knows we're facing a team where they're pretty decent and maybe they're okay, maybe they even have a good system like Titan, but this one guy is the real danger point, and he's so good that if he fucks with us, we could lose the game actually. He could have the 50 kills and we might lose this game actually. So since they know that, they then play a different game, which is called, we're going to shut this guy down. We're going to focus how to fuck with that one guy's play in a way we wouldn't to other teams. And we're going to put the whole focus onto it. If we shut Kenny S down, we probably win this round. If we shut Simple down, we've got a very high chance of winning this round. Now, the great example in the history of this is Kogu, the great Brazilian AWPer. Back when the Brazilian teams weren't that great and they had a bad practice situation, people used to even say in like the top Finnish teams, for example, I remember some of them telling me, like, if you killed Kogu, you knew you'd probably won the round. So the whole game was based around that. It was based around where is Kogu, thinking about him, what to do there. Now think about what that does. First of all, it makes it harder for Kogu, and in this case Kenny S Simple, because people are actively trying to shut them down. Maybe at the expense of what you'd normally do, like a normal balanced attack on a site. They're not as worried about Maniac who's around this corner. They're going for Kenny S with the flashes and the smokes, and then whatever. That opens up Maniac. That opens up other players on this guy's team, because some of the attention that would normally go to them in a more evenly spread team, if you're facing TSM or Fnatic, is now going more towards this one player. So him being the focal point not is making it harder for him, it's making it easier for his teammates actually. Now, you also have to notice that the impact that these guys are having to have on their team goes beyond even what some of the star players have. Now, I won't say it goes beyond like All of Them, because in general, All of Them right now, he was already a very good player in Fnatic. You saw that at the end of 2014. And okay, he was still a good player. And then early 2014, he was approaching star level. But at that point, he was just a star on the best team and they were winning everything. Now he's in like this God mode and on the top team. That's why at the moment they're winning sometimes when Fnatic's not even in the best form. But in general, a lot of the stars who are winning titles aren't actually playing as well as these players I'm talking about. Kenny S Simple in some of these games when they're in their God mode. Now, the reason you have to note that is because it changes the game in terms of how you value the accomplishments of each of the players. If one of these players, Kenny S went earlier on, Simple now, say Simple was even to reach some finals of big international competitions, say he made like the semis of a major or the finals of like a DreamHack Summer type event, or say Kenny S had won a smaller event, like he'd won EPL Winter, or he'd won iOS Pantamera, that actually, in my mind, I would count that in terms of the impact he'd had on that win as more than some of these other people. I'd count that as more than Device winning these last, say, 2 of the events. So he's won 3, maybe I'll add that up to be even, but more than him winning 2 events on a fantastic team with Cage and B backing him, Dupree here, and then even his in-game leader, Carrigan's having these crazy all paths, and he's got a much better team in general. They've got all the maps. The accomplishment of what he's been able to do there, yes, on paper, 3 titles is better than 1, but actually to accomplish this is I think, in some senses, even harder than the 3 over here. And you have to note that. And as a result, that's why there's a heroic quality to it for me. So it's not just about who wins the titles only. Titles alone, without context, is not what we judge greatness of individual players by. Now, there's a great example of this in the NBA or other sports, because in individual sports, obviously team sports, team sports rather, because the problem is in team sports, obviously you win team sports often by being on the best team. At most, even if you're a hard carry, you usually have to be on like the second or third best team to really win the championship. It's very rare you don't in that scenario. But every now and then you get an example where someone goes all the way, like Hakeem on one of the Rockets teams. I think it was might have been the 94 one, I think. They were like a low seed. Dirk Nowitzki on the Mavericks, who they hard carry to a degree, and then they win the championship anyway, which is kind of what I'm describing here. But in general, most of the stars that win, because they're on top teams, you can't just make it like, okay, well, this guy has 4 titles, this guy has 2, the one before must be better. Even when we're talking about stars here, not just talking about normal players. And then obviously, when we're not even talking about stars, we can't judge this guy who isn't the star of the team, who has 4 titles, and say, oh, he's better than the star of a team with 2 titles necessarily. We have to look at the context. So in NBA history, a great example of this, okay, would be the power forward Charles Barkley. If you ask almost any NBA enthusiast, aficionado, they'd have him at least in their top 3 all time at the power forward position. Just one of the best individual players ever, an absolute monster during his kind of Kenny S type peak, which is like sort of 1988 to about 1992. Around that area was his absolute best. Just unstoppable in the 2-point zone on the block. They literally had to change the backing down rules. He was so dominant in that sense. Now, he won 0 titles. He made 1 final, made a bunch of conference finals. And yes, he did have some minor issues at times. Maybe it's mainly injuries that cost him, and then earlier on in his career, in his absolute peak, he didn't actually have the team around him to do it often, or he only had a team that was good enough to get to a conference final and not get any further. So that's mainly what held him back from winning titles. Meanwhile, a player like Horace Grant. Now, Horace Grant has been an all-star, and he was the 3rd best player on the first Bulls run of making 3 finals and winning them all, and then he made the finals with the Magic. Actually, did he? Let me think. Yeah, he did in 95. But the problem is, he's actually not someone where you'd put him even in the same category as Charles Barkley. I don't know anyone who thinks he was as good as Charles Barkley. He was a good player. He was a 3rd star on his team, and he played his position absolutely well, much above average. He would have excellent games and contributed towards these victories. But him having 3 titles does not make him better than Charles Barkley, who has 0 titles. I mean, to pick out a player who isn't even the same position, but so a star player who isn't as good as Charles Barkley. Okay, Dwayne Wade has won 3 NBA championships. Now, he did one of those as the main carrier. That's kind of disputable. He was sort of like the even carry with Shaq, actually. Just in the finals he carried, and so people always remember that better. Now, he actually isn't as great a player as Charles Barkley, and yet he has more than 1 title, even more than 1 as like one of the main guys. He's not as great a player. And for this exact reason, if Charles Barkley had won even 1 in some of the situations he's in, he'd have surpassed some of these guys even more so than he already did on the level of his individual play. Now, to use the same example and bring it into CSGO for you, Kenny S is a greater player in the history of CSGO than Smiths. They're both AWPers. Smiths has won a bunch of titles recently. Kenny S has won no titles recently. Kenny S is quite clearly the better player, even though they're both AWPers, because it takes a lot less for Smiths. He's one of the worst in his team comparable to the rest of them. He has a hell of a lot of talent, all these amazing advantages around him. Kenny S has none of those and has just been a better player, player for player. Now, let's take another player who's a star who's won recently. Okay, Guardians won a bunch of tournaments recently. Won EPL Winter. He just won, obviously, Star Series, and then the year before he'd won a Star Series as well. I'm sorry, Kenny S is a greater player in the history of CSGO than Guardian. And yet in terms of overall titles, I'm pretty sure Guardian hasn't beaten there, and they're both stars. But what Kenny S has done in his whole career is just a better body of work, and in terms of top peak level play, it's much better. And so I'm sorry, Guardian had more help. Even on all these teams, he had other star players. Now, admittedly, on the first one, he didn't have as much, the one where they won Star Series 9, but the more recent one definitely had a lot of help. He had players like Flamey. Even come on, Seized is one of the worst players on his team, and he's obviously a good player, and that's the talent level that guy's team has. Now, what I want to get into is part of this notion that they only succeed because their teams set them up to succeed. First of all, there's a grain of truth to that. That's why I think people have gotten this and skewed it and made it. Haters, I think, have done it for obvious reasons, but I think some people just naively have done this. It's partially accurate in as much as all good teams identify their strengths, work around their strengths, and try to limit their weaknesses. Now, that's a general statement, but all good teams even identify their strengths in players and work around those players, maximize those, and limit their weaknesses, and tend to put the weaker players in positions where they just do this, that, the other, they contribute a bit, but it's all about the stars and giving the stars preferential treatment, funneling resources into them, like giving them a backup player if they want to opt this section, have someone watching this side so he doesn't have to worry about getting peaked. Or if he's a great entry fragger, they give him a good follow-up man who's going to help him out and trade if he dies. Or if he's a great mid-round player like a Shocks of old in very games, they have the good entry fragger who goes in first and is willing to go in no matter what and die so that in can come Shocks and clean up all the kills. Everyone understands this and does base things anyway. So as a result, whenever someone does this sort of godlike play on a great team, well, that's why no one ever says that. Well, no, what's weird is that no one ever says in those cases, oh, you're just doing setup by your team and that's the only reason you look so good, isn't it? So when Get Right, Shocks and all of them are in their super god mode, no one's like, well, it's just because they're in really good teams that, like, oh yeah, weird, that doesn't work. No, they're just playing super godlike play. And, by the way, the reason they win titles is because they have everything else set up. But they in those teams, when those guys are going godlike, they have a lot of preferential treatment going to them. The whole game in very games, to a degree, is based on giving Shocks that space to do what he needs to do. Olofemi, you can see the way when they're down on rounds on T-side. Sometimes they just like, whatever LFM wants and needs, let's put him in the position where he can get these opening kills and break the game open, or he can come in last and win the clutch. Get Right is the best example ever. Anyone who's a Nip fan who says that thing about Kenny S, like only doing it because he's in that team, you're a massive hater, dude. Because one of the major problems in Nip, I'm a huge Get Right fan in terms of, I admire his game rather, but he's one of the most stubborn players in terms of, for him to be at his peak and to be in that godlike form, things have to, on almost all levels of the game, be set up to allow him to do that. He has to not have to take part in certain aspects of tactics. He has to be allowed to slow rotate at times when on other teams you'd say, no, I need you to fast rotate. He has to have all these things set aside for him, and sometimes he doesn't play to the level these godlike players are playing in their god mode now. You have to acknowledge that, first of all, that the stars do it. Now then, with that said, yes, these lower teams are having to do it even more so, but that's because they have even less talent. So the only way they even can win is to set it up like that. Now, what I want to make the point of now is that it's not accurate when you say it like that they only succeed in that way, in as much as it's idiotic in terms of what they're doing in the game. Like, they could be good players like Kenny S is now, or they could even be star players. That they could be on the level of a Dupree or an Edward, a Flamey. Who else should we pick out? Bialy. They could be stars. They could be good players like this with all these things built around them. That there's no requirement for them then to go God mode and Supernova and play at the level like the 4 players have ever done in the history of the game. There's no requirement for that. And that's the whole point. If you just look objectively at what they're doing in the game with your eyes and qualitatively judge what they're doing, you'll see that it's significantly better than anyone else in the game, regardless of what the team's doing. It's utterly insane stuff that you could set everything up and that necessarily wouldn't happen. Because that's the other thing to think of. If it was this easy, you'd get other stars, and then when they're not in a great team, you'd set everything up around them, and then they'd dominate. Like Scream would just be in Super God Mode Shock style now, when you set everything up around him in King Win, and hey, let's just have him go Super God Mode. It doesn't happen. The whole point is, these are such rare instances. This thing has happened now 6 times in the history of CSGO. 6 different players have ever gone Super God Mode like this. Think about that for a second. Actually, is it even 6? No, it's 4. That doesn't make sense, it's 5. So it's Get Right, Shocks, Olaf M, Kenny S, simple. There's 5 players have ever had this Ultra Super God Mode. Now, 3 of them did it on superstar teams. 2 of them are doing it on lesser teams. It's got nothing to do with the team you're on, I'm afraid, guys. That's the first thing. Because they're not just playing very well, like you would if you had all the resources around you and everything's that would be true. They're playing very well, and then they're playing super god mode on top of it and beating everyone and doing things no one could do, regardless of how the team is set up around you. That's what you have to acknowledge. You can't take that down and cut it away and say, it's nothing because their team does it for them. There's also the fact that, as I mentioned before, because things are based around them and the opponent knows that, it actually makes it even harder then. So that balances out some of the advantage you get from that, because now the other team know that you have to try and shut you down. Secondly, it then opens up the play of other teammates that they have. So now other teammates should now understandably be required to do more, but some of them can't because they're lesser teams, and this guy still carries super hard anyway, even when his teammates can't do much, like some of those Kenny S games that were terrible, where his other teams were like, some of them were minuses and he was like plus 20, plus 30, crazy stats. There's also the fact that Kenny S was very nearly in this mode when they had Kaylee in their team and they actually were a legit like 5th best team and they could be expected to win titles. Like they won DreamHack Stockholm, and they might have even surprised other teams if they'd still had Kaylee at that time. Also, you go back just before that team, just before Kaylee's era, before the French Shuffle, Kenny S was the star of that Titan team that had NBK and Smiths, and he was a very good player then. He was one of the top 5 players in the world at that point in time, so he already was very good. Now, the key thing is he hadn't hit the God mode there. He didn't hit the God mode because those players have taken away. That didn't make him suddenly go God mode. He was already very, very good. He was already the best AWPer. Then he hit his God mode, and unfortunately for him, like maybe 1 to 2 months into the God mode is when the player support got took away, and now he had to go God mode even without that, which is even more difficult. If it was so easy, if you can just set up players to do this, and if you put everything around them, then they go God mode like this, where are the other examples of it? I've just said there's 5 examples in CSGO history, like 3+ years, of anyone ever doing this. Where are the examples? Why don't other teams do it? It just doesn't happen. This is one of the weakest arguments I think I've heard. Why do other teams, that are lesser teams that have a star player, why don't they do it? What don't they understand about the game? It doesn't work that way. That's the whole point. In fact, some of these teams, if you funnel all the resources into these guys who are stars, you will actually fuck them over because of the pressure, because of the difficulty of them having to do it, that you would actually ruin the game. I always thought one of the good things that Na'Vi did, when Na'Vi didn't have Flamey and they had less resources, and often it did take Guardian carrying for them to have big results. So part of this was there. They didn't base the whole game around him. They didn't base everything around him, put him in situations where if he doesn't get this opening kill, if he doesn't get this CT kill, the game's lost. They didn't do that because actually Guardian at the time wasn't like a pressure player like that. He oftentimes would. Sometimes he'd even go back to rifling. The pressure would get to him. He would have difficulties. He couldn't hard carry every game. He didn't have that consistency. It would have actually ruined Na'Vi to do that. They couldn't do that, and he as a player could not succeed that way. It's a very naive way of looking at the game to think that these, like existence telling Maniac to watch Kenny S's back is why he hits 3 crazy AWP kills. Also, you have to look at the stuff this guy's doing. Other teams might be able to do this sort of thing online maybe, but there aren't LAN examples of this. On LAN, these guys are in God mode versus every kind of opposition, versus better opponents, and they're doing this stuff. That's because they're godlike players trapped by circumstance. The other ones were godlike players in top teams. These ones are trapped by circumstance. Kenny S is in the French scene where all the best players are envious and there's no other options, and some of the other players got banned, so he's got no options for how to get better teammates or get into a better team, and he can't go to another team. He doesn't speak great English. And Simple, he's got the ESL ban, so no team wants to touch him, and the only other great CIS region team is Na'Vi, and at the moment they're doing great. So it's not that they're only good because on these teams, they're on these teams the other way around because they're really good, but they're trapped by other circumstances. Likewise, the old school 1.6 players, Kogu was trapped in MIBR because he's a Brazilian, Solo's a Korean, he had to be trapped in Project Car. If they could move to other teams, they would, and they'd be just as amazing, but in these other teams. Take Guardian, okay, even now, but okay, Guardian of last year, the same time Kenny started going God mode, and Guardian was the second best AWPer. Take Guardian and put him onto Titan and set everything up around him. Would he be able to do it? No, he wouldn't. Even ignoring their language barriers, he wouldn't have been as good. He might have been a little bit better. He might have, some of this focus might have helped him and funneled his game, but also it might have broken him in terms of the pressure, and also he wouldn't have succeeded to this kind of a God mode. That's just, I don't think it's really even debatable. It's also the case that, let me think, you also have to look the other way at it, which is that part of the reason these teams base everything around these guys, I don't even think they do it that much in Flipside, but in Titan, okay, they were very tactical. So I see why people think that they based everything around KDS, because they did to a degree. Part of the reason is actually the reverse. They base it around him because they realize that's the only way they'll have big success against big teams. And so that means that this guy might be required to do what are otherwise impossible things just to make his team function. So when Kenny S was in his God mode, one of the maps they were good on was Inferno. And on T side of Inferno, Kenny S was entry fragging as an AWPer. Now, on Inferno, most players don't even... They do a bit now, but in this era, the Super CT meta at the end of 2014, most players weren't even using the AWP. Most AWPers weren't even using the AWP on this map. He was using the AWP on T side, and he was entry fragging. Now, there was no other AWPers that were entry fragging. I'm not talking about sitting mid and just picking the guy. I'm talking about being the guy who goes in at Banana at the arch with the AWP. No other AWPer was doing that. No one could do that. He was doing impossible things. That's why you have to acknowledge the godlike level this guy was on. And then his team, because they have an intelligent leader, identified that and said, right, we're going to have to base everything around this. Because at the moment, like, what else is the option? Also, like I said, doing that opened up other players. Part of what made Apex so good at doing those aggressive entries up mid was that he could peek around the corner, knowing that if someone goes around the other side, he's got Kenny S behind him, who when the guy peeks out, if Apex doesn't kill him, Kenny S might kill him. This synergy, opening up the game for other people. Just like in basketball, if you're a star player, you can dribble into the traffic where everyone's going to converge on you because they have to stop you, you're the star, and then you can throw the ball out to a perimeter player who's now wide open for a shot. It makes his life easier. Your life's difficult, you've got the burden, but you can make his life easier as a result. So you have to acknowledge all this stuff because these are some of the greatest players ever in their great form, and somehow people are cutting that down and saying, oh, it's just because of X and Y, and some of it is haterism. It reminds me of people who are like, oh, Messi's only good because he plays at Barcelona for his whole life and has all those great players. Yeah, he does have all those great players, but it doesn't change the fact that you could put any other player there, they wouldn't do that insane shit, would they? You have to acknowledge greatness when you see it and when you're witnessing it and appreciate it for what it is, whether you like the player or not, and whatever the circumstances. Okay, this video was sponsored by Alpha Draft. If you want to play fantasy esports and win money, you can go to alphadraft.com. I'll have a link below. And you can play in CSGO contests, like online ones, like it was ESL, ESEA Pro League. They had like DreamHack Summer. They had contests up for that. You make a team out of salary. I do it all the time. Pick my boy Kenny S, etc. I hope he carries, gives me the points. So yeah, Alpha Draft.